A to the K.
To the K.
A to the K. Hey yo, we are back for another episode of What If. Obviously, the passing of the late great Scott Hall led us to get to thinking, Anthony, what if there was no nWo? Imagine.
I know. Imagine. Like, this is it's a rabbit hole. I think we've been planning on going down this route for a little while, and as you say, I think it's led us sort of thinking about some of Razor and Diesel's best moments. And yeah, what I think this is it's a really good way of sort of honouring his memory, but also talking about, like, infamous What If series, Carl.
Infamous.
Just what if, Carl? So
this reminds me of Three Amigos. That whenever I hear the word infamous, it's infamous.
It's when you're more than just famous, and that is showing our age. Hi
Indeed.
everyone, we're old. So, Carl, I'm thinking, right, because there's so many. This is the trouble with What If in some senses. There's so many different scenarios here. So let's just go with not so much a what if nWo never happened. What if Razor and Diesel never left WWF? Because obviously you could have said, well, what if they come into WCW and just stay as the outsiders? I don't like that. Is roughly nWo early doors, isn't it? So let's go with what would have happened if they re-signed with WWF. Right?
Okay, I like it.
The biggest, most impactful part of this, I know, Carl, is that we do not get fake Diesel.
I know. I mean, actually, yeah. Like without fake Diesel, do we ever get Kane? Because sorry to break the fourth wall here, but fake Diesel was played by Kane.
Whoops! I'm breaking the fourth wall.
Hi, Carl Cabana. I feel like we say this on every week now.
That's shit.
It is. But yeah, it's a fantastic point. We don't get fake Diesel. We don't get fake Razor.
Who did fake Razor end up being?
That's so bad, isn't it? Like, we all know that fake Diesel went on to be Kane, but nobody knows about fake Razor. He was just
you kind of remember his face, though, don't you? It was Kane's face with the
Yes. But yeah, so it's an interesting point that you make. So let's say Razor and Diesel re-sign with WWF. Obviously, it was all about money at the time, so they re-sign. Obviously, one of the big casualties of their leaving, going to WCW, was the infamous curtain call moment. Anthony, would that have ever happened if they weren't leaving? I think not.
Well, that's the thing, and I always found it interesting this because you pointed this out to me, and I've really considered it. The only one who ever really suffered from the curtain call was Triple H, because, as you rightly pointed out, Shawn was the champ at the time.
Can't punish Shawn.
Kind of couldn't really get punished, and obviously everybody loves Shawn. He thinks he's cute. So Triple H infamously was punished. So I think, personally, for me, the first bit I want to discuss is no curtain call, no punishment for Triple H. He was heading up to the main event scene. So speculative albeit, but would we have seen Triple H versus Shawn Michaels?
Well, I mean, Triple H was said to win the King of the Ring in '96, I think it was.
We somehow head back.
Was it '96? Or was it '97? I can't remember. It might be '97. But he was meant to win the King of the Ring during that time. So who knows? Maybe we never even ended up getting the game character. Maybe they would have given him a king gimmick at that point in time.
He would have affected some sort of British accent, because that's what he
exactly.
did.
He was the blue blood, wasn't he, at that point? Hunter Hearst Helmsley. Maybe they would have lent really into that.
Am I right in saying his King of the Ring win was given to Austin?
It certainly was. Yeah.
So we would never have got 316.
Indeed. So there you go. No 316. Just if the curtain call doesn't happen, which is insane. So what would have happened to the likes of Stone Cold then? Like, he would have he was only just coming away from the ringmaster thing. So would he have broke out?
He was still building up as this unorthodox badass. I like to think that the path with McMahon would have always still converged, but it's almost that infamous 316 promo would never have happened. I still think Austin probably would have went in the direction he did, because that character was building anyway, wasn't it, really?
But you see, the thing is with that as well is Would it? Because if you think about it, when Hall and Nash left and went to WCW to do the nWo, that left two giant holes in the roster. Like Diesel was a multi-time world champ. Razor was never a world champ, but he was definitely on the outskirts of that. Maybe if they don't go, opportunities aren't afforded to the likes of Austin or even The Rock.
Well, it's the interesting thing. The roster would have been insanely stacked at that point. Like they kind of needed, like WCW was kind of needed in that sense because it let everyone shine. Because let's face it, a lot of people were watching both where they could, So yeah, you make a really good point. I'm like sort of thinking back to like we had Shawn as champ at the time. I don't know, obviously he didn't necessarily have to stay champ, but I've straight away gone to Triple H doesn't get punished, and we likely might have got Triple H versus Shawn. But at the same time, we now have Razor and Diesel still in the company. So what do you do with them? So it doesn't necessarily have to have been Triple H.
Exactly.
So, like, I find it interesting as this is early doors for me. So like, I was more well versed in Razor and Diesel in WCW. So I find it interesting you mentioned Razor wasn't a world champ at that point. So do you think that was the natural step had he have stayed in WWE?
I mean, if he would have stayed, I imagine money would have been a factor, but probably it would have been nice to sweeten that deal with a world title win. So I'd imagine if him and Nash would have decided to resign, that Scott Hall would have ended up getting that world championship eventually as part of him resigning. Obviously, they were going to have to invest the money in him to keep him. So
you say eventually. I mean, are we talking like could we have potentially seen Hall and Nash turning on Triple H and Shawn? Instead of having the embrace, we have that rivalry instead.
Well, I mean, so if you think about the curtain call, it was taboo at the time because I think Hall was a good. With Hall and I can't even remember, but basically two of them were good guys, two of them were bad guys, and that was a big no-no because the faces and the heels don't mix. So you kind of they were already at odds anyway. But part of me wonders, well, you think about DX and Triple H and Shawn going on to form that together, almost as a direct kind of opposition to the nWo, right? Because it was like, well, they've got a super cool group, so we need something like that. Well, let's do Shawn and Triple H as DX. Maybe we get the nWo/DX, the Kliq. Maybe that becomes a faction in itself. Like if you think about it, at the time, it was a big no-no because it was faces and heels. Maybe they would have done something to put them all together.
We could have maybe seen them turn like I'm gonna guess Triple H and Shawn from memory. That we'd have seen that heel turn and that group. I mean, the Kliq could have been an actual thing rather than a backstage thing. That's crazy.
Exactly, yeah. So so there wouldn't have been a DX, there wouldn't have been an nWo, but there could have been the Kliq, which is their own faction. Who knows? Maybe they would have changed the attitude of the company themselves, within WWE as opposed to WCW, or maybe not. Maybe because if you think about it, WWF at the time was still very gimmick driven. He was still Razor, Ichigo, Scarface type stuff, and he still had fucking a trash man and all these other crazy silly gimmicks, a hockey player, shit. It was a shit time for WWF at the time. If you think about it, before the nWo happened, WWF and WCW were very mundane. It was a low point in the wrestling business because WCW took all the top stars. They had Hogan, they had Savage, they had Flair. But people looked at WCW and were like, well, these are the guys from the 80s. I've seen this. This isn't anything fresh, which is why, even though they had the top stars, WWF was still outperforming them in the ratings. But they were both quite low because WWF at the time had no exciting new characters, no new gimmicks or anything like that. It was all just silly stuff. So, if you think about it, nWo going over really made that culture shock and that culture shift into, reality-based wrestling and kind of lit the fire under it to reignite it. So you've got to ask, where would wrestling be? Like, I'd assume there wouldn't be an Attitude Era.
Well, that's the thing. There wouldn't have been a need for them to shift style and shift attitude. I imagine WCW would have failed a lot sooner, all due respect to it, because they were pulling in big names, and that's probably one of the things we need to talk about. Is like another important member of the nWo would potentially have not turned the heel. Like, I don't know, maybe that was still on the cards anyway, but we're obviously infamously Hogan, Hollywood Hogan, the whole stuff with the NWO, that was a massive shock to the business, because this was Hogan, this was the All-American guy, this was, the hero, as it were, and that heel turn was, well, it's iconic, isn't it? Everyone remembers it. And he was a really important part of the NWO, and he'd have been in WCW on his bill. So what would he have done?
There was no way on earth Hogan was ever going to turn if it wasn't for the NWO, right? It was even, and we'll come on to this in terms of how it affected another WCW mainstay in a minute. But at the time, Hogan, there was no chance of him even turning heel. He had to be. It was very last minute. He was like, okay, I'm going to be the third guy. Like, the fans were really just turning on Hogan. They were booing him. They were sick of it. It was the same shtick we've always had. Take your vitamins. Say your prayers. Blah blah blah. People didn't give a shit anymore.
Take your prayers. Say your vitamins.
Yeah, that kind of shit. So Hogan had been doing that.
WCW would have been on this side here, just repeating Hogan and Savage.
Exactly, which is what they were doing anyway. But Hogan was so stubborn that he was never going to turn heel. He even said to it to Bischoff at the time. He was like, until you've walked miles in Hulk Hogan's shoes, brother, you won't know I can't turn heel and all that kind of stuff. It was literally when he saw there was money to be made, that's when he was like, last minute, okay, I'll be the third guy. So if the NWO wasn't a thing and Hall and Nash didn't go over there, Hogan was going to be a babyface for life.
Yeah, he'd never been loyal to the dark side.
He would have been. He would have been full John Cena. If you think about it, the amount of times everyone was desperate for Cena to turn, and he didn't do it, and that would have been Hogan. Hogan would never have turned.
So so I think Hogan stays face. Hogan carries on the usual him and Savage stuff, and that probably would have absolutely tanked WCW in the ratings, because what edgy product were they offering?
Exactly. It was their tagline at the time was, where the big boys play, and they were getting a lot of things around it's where the dinosaurs play and stuff like that. It was all about them being old. WWF at the time very upset that Hogan and Macho had left, and were going on about how they're all old and doing everything they could to make that out while they were the new generation and all this kind of thing. So maybe people would have just been like, well, because if you think about it, they couldn't have gone on forever, and it was it wasn't very exciting over in WCW. So maybe they would have. Without that spark, maybe their time wouldn't have been that long for this world.
And obviously the knock-on effect being that Bischoff's podcast would have been called 8 Weeks.
I love it. Yeah. Savage. The best kind of savagery right there. So it was all that kind of stuff going on, of course. So we've got WCW kind of still being, WWE as well, still no attitude to it, so still a very kind of dull.
And honestly, an overly stacked roster at that point. I know it's only two guys in a way, but it's two guys in the main scene, isn't it? So where's the space now?
Exactly. I think it would have been I think it would have gone to a much more of a lull for the wrestling business, I think, because obviously they kind of reignited it, that's for sure. So,
without a doubt.
So we had that. It still would have been, a lot more of a wholesome kind of product and stuff like that. But we mentioned that Razor probably would have gone on to be a world champion, which I think, unfortunately wasn't something he got the opportunity to do. So I think that could have led to some very interesting feuds as well down the line with some other people, because I think they had to elevate the likes of Austin and Rock because they'd left a massive kind of hole in there. But what would you have done with Razor Ramon as the champ at the time? Who would he have gone up against? He'd already had his ladder matches with Shawn. Would you have done it, stuff with Diesel?
Diesel's kind of a natural step, isn't it? They probably want to break the friendship up, the tag team up. And it's a WWE thing to do as well. So I feel like that feud would be inevitable if they stayed in WWE. Well, I actually think we'd have probably got a heavy gimmick change as well, because WWE, obviously, I think they would have still notoriously moved away from the cheesier gimmicks, if you will. They probably would have.
I don't know if they would have.
Do you not reckon?
I think Vince McMahon is almost as stubborn as Hulk Hogan to the point where he felt like what he was doing was still working. It was only when they started getting obliterated they were like, we need to change things up, and that's when he did that, infamous thing where he was like, we quite frankly think that you're tired of getting your intelligence insulted and all this kind of thing, where he was like, good guy versus bad guy. And
so on that basis, then you think it would have stayed a much cheesier product, a much more character driven, much more garbage men and hillbillies and
I
stuff.
really do, yeah. And I think it just would have got worse and worse because he'd already exhausted all the gimmicks that were available to him. So, you had Kane coming in as fake Diesel. You had him as fucking Dr. Isaac Yankem, the dentist. It was
God,
literally
yeah,
any profession that existed that he hadn't done, that was what someone was going to be. Even Stone Cold at the time, if you think about it, he was going to be Frosty McFang.
I'm sat here trying to think of a job like that I could do as a joke, and they're all like legit gimmicks that have happened. I'm like, what about accountants? Wait, no, we've done that.
Yeah, done that.
Fuck, it's actually really difficult to come up with one that they haven't tried to do.
Exactly. So there you go. Yeah, but I think the Attitude Era happened in spite of Vince, essentially. That he didn't want to change his product up, but he knew that they were going more reality based. That was working, so he had to adapt to survive, essentially. So yeah, if that didn't happen, I really worry for the future of wrestling today because yeah, it just would have gone into nothingness.
Yeah, I like this what if because it points out how important these two were to the wrestling business.
You wouldn't think it, would you? But like it is like the butterfly effect. If they don't move over there and don't do this NWO thing that gets people going, wow, this is what wrestling could be. The amount of stuff that happened, like a character like Mankind. You would never have had Kane versus Undertaker because even though that was still gimmicky based, it was that that was kind of still a bit more kind of darker, which they were doing
going
at the
for
time.
darker and edgier, weren't they? Yeah.
Yeah, obviously Austin, for example, wouldn't. Would Bret have left?
Okay, go on. It put me on this train of thought. So, was Bret's leaving a money deal as well?
So basically Vince had offered him a fucking 10-year contract or something like that, and Bret took it, and then Vince was like, I can't honour the contract because WCW are basically spanking him, and he can't. But he's going out of business basically, so he can't honour Bret's contract. That's why he told Bret he has to go and seek.
Killing it.
Exactly, they would have never made Bret an offer. Bret would never have left. So you'd like to think that you wouldn't have ended up Bret and.
Here we go, right back again. That the screw job would never have happened.
Well, there you go.
Always comes back to this.
Screw job wouldn't have happened. You'd like to think, Bret Hart wouldn't have ended up getting seriously injured by Goldberg. Maybe Bret Hart would have been able to do these Saudi shows. Today. But yeah, it's a scary thought because if you think about it,
it's interesting. Like you mentioned Goldberg, like that is another knock on. If WCW had failed sooner, Goldberg would never have had his undefeated streak or anywhere near as long. He wouldn't have been as big a deal generally, because WCW would have tanked sooner in theory. So we wouldn't have got the infamous Spear versus Spear match.
Nope, we would not.
Crazy stuff. Okay, here's one for you.
Okay.
People who come up in WCW, would it have affected them? I know I've thrown this in, it's not in our notes, but infamously, Chris Jericho made in WCW.
Mm-hmm.
Eddie Guerrero made in WCW. Would these guys, I like to think they were incredibly talented guys and would have found a way to WWE eventually anyway. Would that have affected their careers because WCW was not a thing? Or essentially affected massively by the NWO? Or do you think their career trajectory would have still been roughly the same?
Yeah, I don't think it would have massively impacted them because I think NWO became so big it took up the majority of the show, which actually, for a good chunk of time, left a lot less time for the likes of your Jerichos and your Eddies and people like that to get TV time.
But that's where the effect comes in, isn't it? Because we saw Jericho debut in, the year 2000 in Jericho. So this is after NWO have come along and took up most of the TV time in WCW. Would it have motivated Jericho to go over to WWF? Yeah. If he was getting more TV time with WCW? WCW might not necessarily have tanked. They might have had more time for people like Jericho.
Yeah, that's a very good point, to be fair. It's fascinating, isn't it? Like, I kind of wish, I wish you could just simulate it somehow in like someone needs to build this like
We need a
simulator.
what if simulator, a what if
Yeah,
machine, if you will.
the
Hey,
what if
Futurama.
3000. But yeah, we need to. Yeah, I'd love to be able just to see exactly what would happen, how it would play out. But I don't know, because if you think about it, because there's people like Ted DiBiase and Virgil and people like that they brought over as part of the NWO storyline because they wanted anybody who had any affiliation with WWE at the time. So it's like, who else came over off the back of that, got involved in it and things. Obviously they ended up going off and doing the Wolfpack. The Wolfpack wouldn't have happened either because there's no NWO.
And then he wouldn't have been causing mass destruction.
Exactly, we wouldn't have had that banger of a song to
It was a banger of a theme. That. Well, I mean, this obviously we haven't talked about him yet, but this had a massive effect on Sting.
Well,
this guy, he was the surfer dude.
Surfer dude Sting. So if you think about it, Scott Hall he came out and said, didn't he, that it was his idea. He saw The Crow. And said to Sting, "Oh, there's this movie called The Crow. I think you should watch it. It could be a good progression for your character."
Changed his fucking life.
And then therein became obviously Crow Sting. But I think Bischoff said in one of the interviews he gave that originally the third man was going to be Sting. Now, if you think about it, I think Bischoff said this as well. If Sting was going to be the third man, the whole point of the NWO was that they were going to be, real, and therefore Sting would have lost all his face paint. It would have gone. It would have been a complete character transformation for Sting. Had that happened. So I guess with the so it's kind of both ways. If the NWO happened and Hogan didn't get involved, then we would have had a completely different Sting. If the NWO doesn't happen, then we would have had the old,
probably
completely
the same
different.
Sting, yeah.
Well, yeah, it would have been the surfer dude blonde Sting, which how much longevity did that have left in it either? It was literally when he became the Crow Sting. That's when he became larger
I think
than life.
That was his fame. I don't be wrong. People remember like the really way back Sting, like notably a friend of ours, Phil, has a lot of affinity for that Sting rather than the Crow Sting, and that makes a lot of sense depending on the era that you're really into it. But I dare say what made him sort of massively famous in a lot of people's eyes, or at that point that wrestling was going really big, was the whole Crow thing, wasn't it? Really?
Yeah. It just added so much more to his character, the whole mystique, the fact he was up in the rafters, and it was very Undertaker-like, wasn't it? It was like their answer to Taker. Yeah. It was,
in all fairness, yeah, which is why everyone really wanted Taker versus Sting for so long.
He was that kind of like I can't think of the right word to use, but that kind of character that was like so. What's the word?
Yeah, what's the word?
I don't know. Like he was a separate entity. It's like a whole different. It's like a whole different entity, wasn't he? So, yeah,
and I think another notable name impacted by the NWO as well, which again could be impacted by this whole what if, is Sean Waltman.
Well, yeah, he got fired from WWF, didn't he? As 1-2-3 Kid.
Someone famously in both the NWO and WWF's answer to the NWO. Being DX.
You know what? It's mad when you think about that, isn't it? Sean Waltman, like, he's the only guy to have gone across both and done both sides of that. Like the two biggest, factions in WWE history. Really, it's insane to think about. But it's an interesting one. I think whether they would have been the Kliq in WWF at the time, whatever. I still think Sean Waltman would have found his way back, even after they fired him. Not as the 1-2-3 Kid. They probably would have done something else with him, but I think he would have been part of it as well.
He was the 1-2-3 Kid. When was he 6? I can't remember.
So he was 6 when he went to WCW after getting fired as 1-2-3 Kid. So when he joined, when he joined NWO, he was 6. And then when he came back, he was X-Pac.
Right. Okay. So 1-2-3 Kid was WWE. WWF to I get you.
Yeah. And I mean, obviously he was already in the Kliq, you know what I mean? Him and Scott Hall, very tight, especially when he was 1-2-3 Kid. So I think he always would have found his way back there. But yeah, it's a mad thought to think like of that. The likelihood of having that dream faction of the NWO and DX combined into one in the one company, I think is, had a high likelihood of playing out.
Yeah.
Which would have been interesting. But it's whether or not they would have, because to your question, like where I honestly think they would have stayed very PG, gimmicky, family friendly with it. But
Doing turkeys all over again, with giant turkeys fighting each other.
Exactly. But if they had to change with the times and stuff like that, then maybe the Kliq thing would have evolved into that. Maybe it would have been Hall and Nash actually pushing for that anyway, and it might have happened. And so, but yeah, we wouldn't have got obviously all the insane DX comedy aspect. I think that's something that DX did that was different. It was they were very more comedy driven, whereas NWO were very more kind of, fucking mafia, real life type stable.
Yeah, I take your point. Yeah, there's a massive difference in that sense, really.
Yeah. But yeah, so I think the landscape of wrestling could have been very different, Anthony. I think, Hulk Hogan never would have turned heel. We would have never had NWO. WCW could have died a death a lot earlier. I mean, was there anyone else in WCW that could have done that? I guess, like, say for example, Hall and Nash didn't come over. We know for a fact Hogan wouldn't have turned. Like, what could they have done that would have?
See, I think this is where you go. Like, it wasn't planned, but it's like almost like a perfect set of circumstances, because I don't think anyone could have done it, because the NWO was born of the sort of attitudes and charisma of Hall and Nash.
Mm.
Don't get me wrong, there could have been maybe similar things that we're not seeing right now, but I'm looking at, like, the whole thing was born out of them coming over, infamous promos as to them being there, them being the outsiders. Hogan joining made absolute sense because they were outsiders, and the whole thing just it was like a perfect storm of situations and characters. That's like it's interesting how these things happen, isn't it? Because no one's designed this, but it like this was so important to the world of wrestling. Like, it needed to happen.
Yeah, it's crazy how pivotal of a moment this was. I think, because if this doesn't happen, then wrestling may not even be a thing today. It may have just died out, never gained back the popularity it did.
Yeah.
I think
more like it'd still be more like a indie carny type thing.
Well, today. Exactly. Like, we talk about it now as saying, it's kind of losing popularity. With us, especially like WWE at the minute, like storyline wise and stuff, like we're not as into it as we were a while ago, for example. And you have these peaks and troughs of wrestling, but maybe this could have been something that they didn't recover from. Maybe the interest just would have waned and waned and waned to the point where it wasn't cool anymore.
Fair. I think most of the wrestling's fame came from the Monday Night Wars, didn't it?
Yeah.
Like, that's what started the whole Attitude Era and started basically our generation being sort of just massively into wrestling.
Yeah.
Like, to the point that literally everyone in our high school at one point was into wrestling.
Yeah. I mean, that in itself, like, if this doesn't happen and popularity wanes, who's to say that a lot of the wrestlers who went on to be massive stars today would have even been into wrestling when they grew up, and to know what it was and to get into it and to go on to be stars? Do you know what I mean? I mean, you've got obviously a couple of exceptions, like your Randy Orton was as a second, third generation guy.
Yeah,
Rock's third generation. So they still would have been.
You'd be talking people like potentially like CM Punk or Kevin Owens and all that, who grew up on
exactly
like that sort of that. Well, probably not even CM Punk actually, because he was more like a Bret Hart kind of guy. But like that sort of generation coming up, loving wrestling and loving the Attitude Era. So that's fascinating.
I think the really telling part of that is we can't think of any major new stars to go. It would have really impacted them because they're still the old guard, isn't it? Today, it's still
it kind of is, actually, in all fairness. Okay. See, it's weird. Like, there seems to have been like a skip in my mind, and I'm sure there's plenty of people, but I'm like, my head went maybe like the likes of MJF, and I'm like, MJF's young enough to have, like, he really looked up to CM Punk.
Yeah.
Where's the other generation?
Exactly.
In between guys.
I'm trying to think. Is it like your Drew McIntyres and stuff?
Possibly your Drews, yeah.
Maybe. Yeah. Interesting.
Okay, might have to look into that a little bit. I'm curious. Our generation who grew up on the Attitude Era, where are those guys?
Where are them guys? Yeah, I think, like I said, I think, I think the really telling part of that is we can't think of any major new stars to go. It would have really impacted them because they're still the old guard, isn't it? Today, it's still the old guard. it's crazy to think what a pivotal moment this actually was, and I don't think a lot of people would ever realize it. Like, it's just seen as like, oh yeah, the NWO, that was cool, but it's like it is actually quite a groundbreaking moment. Like, you know, if this doesn't happen, you potentially don't get Stone Cold Steve Austin. You potentially don't get The Rock, who's now the biggest movie star. Like, if The Rock doesn't get his chance to shine on the microphone and he's just Rocky Maivia and he doesn't have to change his gimmick because, well, you know, they don't need to invest in him because they've already got, you know, Diesel and Razor, so he's even lower on the pecking order. Then do we ever get The Rock? You know, it's
crazy to think, isn't it? Or like, because again, you could talk about this all day, so I won't go delve too far into this. But then, if they didn't go over, would that have motivated other people to go over to WCW to get their chance to shine?
Maybe. I think
that the possibilities are endless in that sense.
Yeah, even like Triple H, like he went on to be the leader of DX when Shawn, you know, had to retire, or whatever. If that, you know, if Hall and Nash were still there, then Triple H ain't going to lead that faction. So Triple H never goes on to be the world champion main event guy because he's never put in that light. So it does massively it affects a lot of the top stars that came out of the Attitude Era, because
I think I've been really enjoyed this one because I don't think I personally appreciated how much Hall and Nash affected the business.
No.
And I think this conversation has made me go, you know what? They're like, it was such a big thing, and I don't think, like you say, you don't think about it too much, do you? But
no, definitely, yeah. If it didn't happen, then we wouldn't have a podcast because we wouldn't like wrestling anymore, and we wouldn't.
Well, we'd have a podcast, but it'd be about like, what else do we like? Skateboarding. I don't know, random.
Yes, we love that skateboarding these days.
That was a fad, wasn't it?
It was. We were into it for a bit. I think it would have been better if we fell off less and could do more tricks.
Yeah, that would have helped.
But Tony Hawk's Pro Skater was pretty cool, and that's where all that came from. So yeah, it's not going to be the A2theK Wrestling Show without a bit of a segue there at the end of it. Or tangent even. We didn't segue to anything, we just went off on a tangent. But yeah, that was our what if the NWO didn't happen? What if Scott Hall and Kevin Nash stayed with WWF?
And as always,
is there anything we missed?
Exactly. That's what I love about these. The possibilities are endless. What do you think could have happened, would have happened, should have happened? We're fascinated. We love it.
Indeed. Yeah, another fun-filled one. Obviously, we love doing these on different topics. I think we put a few different ideas out there. I think you voted on a few for us on our Instagram, so a few more are going to come up relatively soon. But yeah, thanks for sticking with us for this episode of What If. If you haven't already, check out the Ringside Report. We're talking all the latest news, and obviously you can also check out This Week in Wrestling, where we talk all the happenings from the big shows. But it's been emotional. It's been another fun-filled week. WrestleMania, not that far away now at all, is it? Really? 2 weeks away?
Not far at all. 2 weeks.
Something like that.
2 damn weeks.
So yeah, obviously A2theK is still running wild. So if you haven't already, go and enter our competitions that we've got going at the minute. And until next week, we're going to leave you with this little video or little kind of promo around For the Love of Wrestling, which is the UK's and Europe's, I think, largest wrestling convention, coming to Liverpool this April. So until next week,
bye.
For Love of Wrestling, Europe's largest wrestling convention, returns to the Exhibition Centre in Liverpool on the 23rd and 24th of April. Guests this year include Diva of the Decade, Trish Stratus, the Wrestling God, JBL, the Dudley Boys, Torrie Wilson, and just announced MJF from AEW. We will also be doing a Wyatt family reunion as we welcome Eric Rowan, the man formerly known as Braun Strowman, and indeed the Fiend Bray Wyatt. Also just announced is the man, the legend, the icon, Sting, and of course your Olympic gold medalist Kurt Angle. This and many, many, many more guests, as well as prop builds, Q&As with all of the wrestlers and some of the biggest wrestling collections in the world on display from our exhibitors. Get your tickets at forloveofwrestling.co.uk or search Facebook or Twitter for the Love of Wrestling. For the Love of Wrestling, Europe's biggest wrestling convention, returns to Liverpool the 23rd and the 24th of April.
This is Griff Garrison, and you're listening to A to the K.
A to the K. A to the K.
A to the K.